Sorry about that. I had to fix something real quick. So anywho, so you're starting to see changes, and one of the biggest voices for that change is going to be a guy named Malcolm X. Malcolm X was originally named Malcolm Little. He's from the North. Like, he was from the Midwest. He never lived in the South. Malcolm Little got arrested in the 1940s, went to jail for some breaking and entering and so forth. Goes to jail and converts this new religion called the Nation of Islam or Black Muslims. So it's called the Nation of Islam or Black Muslims. Either way is correct. And he's influenced by the teachings of this man named Elijah Muhammad, who's a black man in America. So, and what basically happens is that you have these black culture adopts the teachings of Islam, and so the Nation of Islam as a religion incorporates both. As far, they still have their prayers they do to the east and all these different things, but they're also including black culture as well. Hence why they changed their names. Like Malcolm Little changed his name to Malcolm X because he wanted to drop his slave name. Same thing. Elijah Muhammad wasn't born Elijah Muhammad. He changed his name to Elijah Muhammad whenever he started promoting this religion. But Elijah Muhammad promoted these ideas of black separatism, nationalism, and self-improvement. So blacks basically should do things for themselves, should be proud of themselves, should try to improve themselves without depending upon white society. So Malcolm X believes all this and eventually becomes this big voice for it. So he leaves jail in 1952, now a member of this Nation of Islam religion, and becomes a preacher. And so throughout the 50s and later in the 60s, as we get into the 60s and people are becoming more dissatisfied with the nonviolent approach, thinking the nonviolent approach doesn't work as well, especially when she's at the 60s, Malcolm X becomes this voice for this alternative to King, this more militant or more aggressive approach to civil rights as a result. He even calls MLK an Uncle Tom, saying that MLK shouldn't be trying to appease whites, should not be trying to help out whites. Whites are oppressive to them. And so Malcolm X and these guys do not promote this idea of inclusion. So he gets a big following, gets a lot of people who support his ideas. Later on, he breaks away from Elijah Muhammad and the Church of Black Muslims and so forth because there was accusations of affairs that he was having. So Malcolm X breaks away because of Elijah Muhammad was having affairs. So Malcolm X breaks away, starts his own following, still very militant and so forth. What Malcolm X promoted was self-defense. Basically, that if you shouldn't start a fight, you should not go out looking for fights. But if you get attacked by a white person, then you have the right to hit back. That you should be carrying a gun or carrying weapons, and you should practice self-defense. So something happens to you, you fight back. You don't just let it happen. And that was a big push that he had. So anyway, so he actually goes to Mecca, because if you're a Muslim, you're supposed to go to Mecca in Saudi Arabia to do like your once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage. So in late '64, he takes his once-in-a-lifetime trip to Mecca, and he comes back kind of with a renewed type of idea. So when he comes back to America, he's kind of had a change of heart a little bit and not so aggressive as he once was. So when he comes back, he has this new idea called ballot or the bullet speech. So it's called the ballot or the bullet speech. In this speech, what he promotes is this idea of before we try to do a more militant approach to things, let's try to change things through a ballot first. So let's try to make change through voting for it, and if that doesn't work, then you get aggressive and get more militant. Some of the people in his own group didn't like that. They felt like he'd gone soft. And so in February of 1965, while he's giving a speech in New York, there are some black men in the audience who, all of a sudden cause this big panic and then assassinate Malcolm X. So there's black men who kill Malcolm X because they disagree with some of the things that he's starting to preach and promote now, and so they kill him as a result of his change of heart and so forth. But make sure you're aware of his ideas of black nationalism, separatism, his idea of self-defense, having a separate white and black society, him going to Mecca, having a change of heart, coming back, promoting this new idea of ballots or the bullets, and eventually get assassinated in '65 by blacks. But his legacy lives on because he's often seen as this alternative to King, and who criticized King as a black man, saying that blacks should be more aggressive towards trying to secure their freedoms. Other issues that come out, you have black power issues and race riots. Malcolm X's radicalism influenced young African Americans in SNCC and CORE. So you're seeing a lot of young African Americans getting dissatisfied by the mid-60s with the lack of change from nonviolent approaches, and so members of CORE and SNCC begin to become more aggressive by 65, 66. The leader of SNCC in 1966 is a guy named Stokely Carmichael. His name is Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael, leader of SNCC in 66, had been arrested like over a dozen times, gotten beaten up, and finally after doing, this was their third Freedom Summer, after trying to do this Freedom Summer again in 66, he said enough is enough. We're no longer going to try to do black inclusion and so forth. We're going to try to have black power. So basically, Stokely Carmichael and members of CORE and SNCC in the South developed this concept of black power, which also preaches this message of black separatism, black nationalism, and not relying upon white society. In fact, Stokely Carmichael and members of CORE and SNCC remove all their white people and stop allowing white people to join CORE and SNCC because they want to be able to promote this idea of black power and black separatism and so forth. And so they didn't want to. They wanted to end segregation in the sense of like, blacks should be able to do what they want, but they wanted blacks to have self-sustained society. Okay, and then also in 1966, on somewhat of a related note, not directly, in Oakland, California, you get a new group called the Black Panthers form. So you get a group called the Black Panthers form in Oakland, California. They were tired of white law enforcement abusing blacks in their cities, attacking black people for not good reasons and so forth. And so the Black Panthers decided to form this militant group to be like their own law enforcement. But they also preached this idea of black separatism, black nationalism. So the idea of the Black Panthers was they drove around the neighborhood, patrolling their own neighborhood, making sure that they protect themselves. They kept white officers out of the neighborhoods. There was even shootouts between them and white officers. But what's also kind of cool about them is that they also do things that help their community. They actually offered breakfast programs for like people in the community. They did programs for the elderly. They did programs for childcare, medical programs like free clinics and stuff like that. So it's crazy. But the Black Panthers do a lot of community outreach too, trying to promote this idea of black separatism. They're also known for their uniforms. They wore like their afros out. They wore leather jackets. They wore a lot of black. They wore sunglasses. They wore berets. All that was part of the Black Panther ensemble, if you will. Okay, so those are examples of black nationalism rising up. You have Stokely Carmichael and the movement towards black power with SNCC and CORE. So that's something to keep in mind too, is that in the mid-60s, SNCC and CORE, who were once committed to nonviolence, are now promoting more aggressive and militant reactions, whereas SCLC and King are throughout the 60s still promoting nonviolence. So there's a distinction that happens there in the mid-60s. And of course you get Black Panthers, same thing, black nationalism, black separatism. There's also a series of riots that take place throughout the 1960s because of race. Black Panthers rhetoric made whites suspect black extremists and revolutionaries. So as blacks get more militant, it leads to more riots because whites are also scared, and so there's a lot more aggression. Police get more forceful throughout the country, which sparks a lot of riots. Probably one of the biggest riots in this time period was the Watts riot, spelled W-A-T-T-S, like Mr. Watts. The Watts riot that took place in 1965 in L.A. So one of the biggest riots was the Watts riot in 65. In fact, like the Rodney King riots that happened there in 1992 are compared a lot to the Watts riots. But the Watts riots in Los Angeles was a result of black versus white racism. These riots, when they were all done, killed 34 people, and it destroyed 700 buildings. So it killed 34 people and destroyed 700 buildings. There was little evidence connecting these people to the Black Panthers or anything like this, but still, Watts was a major, one of the major race riots. And there's going to be a lot of other race riots in like Detroit, Chicago, New York. There's race riots throughout the country, but Watts was the big one. In 1968, the federal government did an investigation called the Kerner Commission, Kerner, so K-E-R-N-E-R, that concluded, get this, that racism amongst whites and segregation were chiefly responsible for the separation of two societies and for all the race problems and so forth. So But again, that's the issue of this: the fact of segregation. The segregation you can't fight or change a law as easily with, because what you're dealing with, like King himself came up to Chicago to march, and he had rocks thrown at him in Chicago, which is this northern city, trying to help desegregate it there. But you can't pass a law saying, like, okay, this is a black neighborhood and here's a white one. There's no law that you can pass saying that blacks have to move in this one and vice versa. You can't do that. So what de facto you have to think about is things like housing, things like education, because yes, maybe now blacks and whites get to go to the same public schools, but that doesn't mean that blacks get the same educational opportunities when it comes to colleges and things like that to address. So those are the issues that de facto segregation you have to figure out how to fight, and that's one of the biggest frustrating parts about civil rights in the late '60s is how to address these issues going forward. Okay. So, de facto was a big challenge throughout the rest of the 60s, mostly in the North, mostly out West, because there weren't just these easy laws to change and fix like that. Okay, so then we have the assassination of MLK. MLK received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 for his efforts and so forth. So he receives the Nobel Peace Prize in '64. But his nonviolent approach was taking more heat as the 60s go on. He attempted to go out to the north and do these marches there, like Chicago, but had little success. MLK did not support LBJ, or MLK supported Johnson originally over the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act, but eventually had a break with Johnson over Vietnam because he felt like blacks should not be drafted to go fight in Vietnam if they don't have the same rights here in America. So he eventually broke out and spoke out against Vietnam too. Then in April 1968, King is going there to help this protest march in Memphis. While he's out in his hotel balcony, he's shot from across the way by a man named James Earl Ray, a white man named James Earl Ray, who's been arrested and still is in jail. He's alive today. So King dies after this assassination, which was a big blow to civil rights because he was this big, nonviolent leader through all this. And unfortunately, as a direct result of this, immediately after, there's over 100 cities that break out in riots. So as a direct result of King's death in April '68, over 100 cities break out into riots because of this. And so it's kind of sad what happens, but this is a direct result of King's death. And so that immediately emerges after this. So when this is all said and done by the end of the '60s, African Americans in the South, things are getting better. They're able to vote more. That's a big improvement. They're getting more educational opportunities. They're getting more chances to vote, which means they're getting more people in office. But things aren't better. I mean, things are still even improving today. It's just a very slow process. But does civil rights make an impact? Certainly. It certainly does. Not as drastic as people would like to have seen it, but it does happen. And civil rights in general as a movement kind of starts to taper off in the early '70s. One of the biggest results of civil rights movement in the '60s and '70s is this new idea, or this new government policy called affirmative action. So affirmative action is this new one big legacy of civil rights, where the government now has this policy where whenever you take in people to like public universities like LSU or Southern or whoever, or whenever you take in people to jobs even, that you can't discriminate. So you have to, basically jobs have to meet a certain quota of minorities, or else you might have investigations brought to you, even lawsuits. So, like for LSU, if LSU next year takes in 100 freshmen, let's say that because of affirmative action, at least 15 of those have to be minorities. Now they have to meet the standards of all that, but the idea is if there are top 100 students who get in, let's say that those bottom 15 were all white. Well, because you have to add minorities in, the bottom 15 now have to be minorities no matter what. So it does kind of create some inequality in that regard, but the idea behind affirmative action was that there was such a long period of inequality for African Americans that something like this was necessary. And we still have it today. It still goes around now. It's even been upheld by the Supreme Court and so forth. But people are in a lot of ways calling for its demise now because they feel like it's not necessary as it once was back in the 1960s and 70s. And people feel like in 2016 we can get rid of affirmative action, but we still have it now too. And of course there's a lot of other issues with civil rights, but that's where we're going to stop there as far as their accomplishments go. And that's where we're going to stop this video too.